I've been called many things in my life. Some of them have been earned, some not. But that night, in the soft glow of wedding lights, surrounded by the people I had helped raise, support, and love, I heard a label that stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. It was during the toast. The clinking of glasses had quieted the room, and my new son-in-law stood at the center, all charm and polish. He knew how to hold an audience, how to wear a smile that looked effortless. He began with the usual, thanking the guests, speaking about love and family. But then he looked toward me. "He's just a waiter," he said with a grin that invited laughter. "But the best kind. He's been serving people his whole life." There was a ripple of polite chuckles. A few glanced my way, unsure if they should laugh harder or look away. I smiled, or at least I think I did. My face knew how to arrange itself into something neutral. The word just hung heavier than the rest. I didn't respond. My hand stayed wrapped around the base of my glass, my posture steady. But inside, something shifted, like a door I didn't know was open had just been closed. I've worked in many places over the years, restaurants, hotels, private events. I've worn the uniform and carried trays with a kind of balance you learn only through repetition. It's honest work. It puts food on the table. But in his voice, it wasn't meant as respect. It was meant as reduction. After the toast, people went back to eating and talking. The hum of conversation returned. The band played something light, and I was left in the shadow of that sentence. Later, my daughter leaned over and said softly, "Don't take it personally." He was joking. "I'm fine," I replied, and in that moment, I almost believed myself. But as the night went on, I noticed the way people interacted with me. Some treated me warmer than before, as if compensating. Others kept their distance, as though the label had redefined me in their minds. I thought about all the nights I had worked double shifts to cover bills, the mornings I had helped her with school projects, the weekends I had skipped rest to be there for family gatherings. None of that was visible now, not in the glow of chandeliers and champagne. When the dancing began, I stayed seated. The music didn't reach me. I watched my daughter, radiant in her dress, and I wondered if she noticed a subtle shift in the air. Much later, as the crowd thinned, he approached me. "Hope you didn't mind the joke," he said, smiling like he'd given me a compliment. "It's fine," I answered, but it wasn't, not because of the word itself, but because of what it revealed, the ease with which he could make my life's work sound like a limitation. Walking back to my seat, I realized something important. Silence can be sharp. It can be more cutting than a defense. It gives the other person room to think about what they've said, to replay it in their mind. I didn't need to argue with him in front of everyone. I didn't need to correct the record. I knew who I was, and I knew my story was bigger than any title. That night, as I drove home, the road ahead was dark and quiet. My reflection in the rear-view mirror looked the same as it had that morning, but something in me had settled differently. I had been reminded, by accident, of the power in not reacting, in letting someone's words hang in the air until they reveal more about them than they ever will about you. The world will always find a way to reduce you to a single word if you let it, but sometimes the best reply is to keep walking, to let your actions speak when the moment is right. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the start of a shift. Not in them, but in me. I would no longer spend energy proving myself to people who had already decided who I was. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the stillness. The house was dark, the kind of quiet that feels both empty and comforting. I stepped inside, hung up my jacket, and poured myself a glass of water. The taste was clean. I thought again of the toast, the smile, the laughter, the casual dismissal. And then I thought about the years I'd spent building a life that had nothing to do with titles or applause. The truth was simple. I wasn't just anything. I went to bed that night without replaying the conversation in my head. Instead, I focused on the one thing I could control, how I carried myself from this moment forward. And in the silence, I found my answer. If you're enjoying the video, hit that subscribe button and drop your country's name in the comments. The next time I saw them was 2 weeks later. At a Sunday lunch my daughter insisted on hosting. She said it would be casual, but the table was set like a magazine spread. White plates, silver cutlery, flowers in a vase that looked like it had been placed there for photographs. I arrived early. I always did. Years of working in service made punctuality second nature. I helped carry dishes from the kitchen to the dining room, setting them down carefully, checking angles without even thinking. When they walked in, my son-in-law greeted me with the same easy charm. "Glad you could make it," he said, as if I was a distant acquaintance rather than family. My daughter kissed my cheek, holding on just a second longer than usual. We sat. He took the head of the table. I took the far end. There was a stretch of polish between us, but it felt like miles. Conversation flowed around me. Work stories from his office, plans for the next holiday, inside jokes I didn't understand. My daughter tried to pull me in now and then. "Dad, remember that trip we took?" she'd ask, but before I could answer, the topic would change. I wasn't invisible. I was present, but I was peripheral. When dessert came, he leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand. "You know, you'd love the restaurants in Paris," he said to me. "But of course, you'd end up in the kitchen with the staff, right?" The table laughed again. This time, I noticed my daughter's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't respond. Instead, I cut into my slice of cake, letting the fork scrape softly against the plate. The sound was small, but it felt like it cut through the noise. Here's what they didn't understand. Distance isn't always about space. Sometimes it's about attention, about the way people choose where to place their focus. And over that long table, I realized they had already placed me in a role, background, after lunch. While the others were in the living room, I stayed behind to clear the table. Old habit. He passed by on his way to refill his glass and said, "You really are good at this, you know." "Thanks," I replied, because it was easier than saying anything else. But as I stacked plates, I felt something settle into place inside me. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the kind of clarity that comes when you stop expecting someone to see you differently. That afternoon, when I left, my daughter walked me to the door. "Dad, about what he says sometimes," she began. "It's fine," I told her. And in some ways it was because I was starting to understand that I didn't need his respect to know my worth. Still, as I drove home, I thought about the space between us. Not the literal distance across a table, but the kind that comes from someone deciding they've already figured you out. The road was quiet, lined with bare trees swaying in the wind. I thought about all the tables I had stood beside in my life, serving strangers, carrying weight without complaint. This was no different, except now I was deciding how much I would carry. The truth was, every comment he made, every laugh at my expense, was building something, not resentment, foundation, a slow, steady reason to stop playing the role they'd assigned me. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew this much. I didn't need a fight to sit at his table. I could build my own. And that thought, quiet as it was, felt like the start of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine in years. I stopped waiting to be invited closer. 2 days after that Sunday lunch, a friend from the old restaurant called. They were short on hands for a private reception the same weekend. "Could you cover a shift?" he asked. I said yes before he finished the sentence. It wasn't about money. It was about remembering who I was when no one was measuring me. When I picked up a uniform from the back closet, black slacks, pressed white shirt, vest that fit like muscle memory, I didn't feel small. I felt precise. There's a kind of order that comes with clean lines and a task you can complete with steady hands. Maybe I needed that more than I realized. On the afternoon of the event, I arrived early, the way I always do. I checked the floor plan, counted place settings, straightened cutlery without thinking. That discipline had raised my daughter as much as I had. It paid the rent, the tuition, the gaps no one else noticed. Before guests arrived, the event manager walked me through the service flow. "Keep the pour light," he said, tapping the rim of a flute. "Smile, but don't linger. We move, we don't crowd." I nodded. I already knew. Service is choreography. Seen by everyone, noticed by few. When the doors opened, the room filled with people who resemble each other in confidence, if not in face. The kind who speak in declarative sentences and rarely ask follow-up questions. I drifted at the edges, the way good staff do, present, never centered. The noise rose and fell in waves around me. Laughter, glasses, cutlery, the rustle of expensive fabric. There's a rhythm to evenings like this, and my body still knew the beat. Somewhere after the first course, I thought about my son-in-law again, not his words, but the ease with which he uses them. How effortless it must feel to dismiss someone when the room always returns your gaze. There was a time I wanted that gaze back. Tonight I didn't. It felt peaceful to be necessary and unnoticed. During a break, I stepped into the corridor for water. The bar back, barely 20, was stacking racks of clean glasses. He glanced up. "You're quick," he said. "Just practiced," I answered. He smiled. "My mom works doubles too. People don't get how hard it is to keep moving." "They don't have to," I said. "We know." Back on the floor, I watched small human puzzles play out at each table. A man rehearsed his business story for the 4th time, each version sharper than the last. A woman laughed too brightly and went quiet too fast. Someone else kept glancing at their phone, the way people do when their attention lives somewhere else. It struck me then. I had spent months trying to earn a chair at conversations I didn't even want. Not because I didn't belong, but because belonging there would have cost parts of me I wasn't willing to sell. At the dessert pass, the pastry chef asked for a hand with plates. We moved side by side, placing tartlets in 2 identical rows. "Even spacing," she murmured, not looking up. "I know," I said, and she smiled without stopping. That small exchange felt like respect the size of a room. Near the end of service, I saw a couple arguing softly by the window. They weren't loud, just locked in that posture you learn to recognize after years in dining rooms. Hands still, eyes fixed, words careful. I kept my distance, refilled the tables around them, and by the time I circled back, their faces had softened. Sometimes the work is holding space until people find their way through. When the last plates cleared, the room shifted into that gentle tiredness at the edge of celebration. Music quieted, laughter thinned, chairs eased back. I stacked trays, collected napkins folded and abandoned, polished the water rings only I would see. There's a comfort in leaving a place better than you found it. The manager signed off on hours and clapped my shoulder. "Good to have you back," he said. "Good to remember." I replied. On the way home, I took the long route. Lights from storefronts blinked the way they do on quiet streets, a language you understand if you spend enough late nights walking through them. I thought about the distance I'd felt at my daughter's table. how far away love can seem when pride sits in the middle of the plate. And I thought about the comment tonight. Work done cleanly without explanation or performance. At a red light, I caught my reflection. Same face, different steadiness. I didn't need to win a debate. I needed to stop entering it. The uniform had reminded me, dignity doesn't ask permission. It's a posture you carry, even when someone else tries to name you. When I reached home, I hung the vest on the back of the chair and smoothed the fabric with my palm. The habit was automatic. The thought that followed wasn't. I didn't have to force myself into anyone's story. I could choose mine. Quietly, firmly, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message from my daughter. Are you free this week? I typed back, always. Then I deleted it and wrote, Wednesday works. I'll bring coffee. Small edit, big difference. Availability becomes a trap if you don't draw lines around it. Before bed, I made a list in my head. Not grievances, boundaries. What I would accept, what I wouldn't carry. How I would speak to myself when the old shame tried to return. That list felt like an idea taking shape, simple and stubborn. I turned off the light and lay there, the room quiet enough to hear my own breathing. Somewhere in the stillness, a sentence formed and stayed. I won't argue with anyone about my worth again. The next morning, I pressed the shirt, folded the vest, and put the uniform away. Not hidden. Ready? It was midweek when the phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail. Mr. Rivera? The voice was calm, professional. This is Andrea from the local network. We're putting together a feature on small-town resilient stories. Your name came up more than once. I thought it was a prank at first. And you want what exactly? To interview you about your years running the Harbor House and the community programs you started after the flood. We'd like to film it. It'll air next month. The name of the restaurant felt like a tide coming in, steady, familiar, and heavier than I'd expected. I hadn't heard it spoken outside my own memory in years. I agreed to meet her at the station on Friday. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the chipped rim of my mug. I thought about the years after my wife passed, when I kept the doors of the restaurant open even though the books bled red ink. How we served free meals to displaced families without putting on the menu. How kids used to do homework in the back booth while their parents worked night shifts. None of that had been about recognition. It was survival, for me as much as for them. Friday came, and I put on the same suit I'd worn to my daughter's graduation. At the station, the air was cooler than outside, and the walls were lined with framed photographs of anchors, musicians, and local figures who'd passed through. Andrea met me in the lobby. Well, keep it relaxed, she said, leading me to a small set. The lights were bright, but the space felt contained, like a quiet corner of a bigger room. The first question was simple. When did you first feel part of this town? I didn't have to think. The night the bridge washed out, I said, we had strangers sleeping in the booths. Nobody paid. We just kept the coffee going. She nodded, letting me keep the floor. We talked about food as memory, about how a well-cooked meal can pull a person back from the edge. I spoke about my staff like they were family, because in every way that mattered, they were. When the cameras stopped, Andrea leaned forward. You know this is going to resonate, she said. People remember who showed up. I smiled, but inside, something shifted. I'd spent so much time being defined by absence, by the roles I'd left, the invitations I didn't get, that I'd almost forgotten the things that were still mine. A week later, the segment aired. I didn't tell my family in advance. I didn't think much of it beyond the fact that it was done. That Saturday, my daughter called. Her voice was careful. Dad, we saw you on TV. I waited. You looked proud, she said finally. I didn't know half of what you did for that place. It wasn't just me, I said. Still, she added, you should have told us. I let the pause stretch, not out of pettiness, but because I didn't have the right words yet. By Monday, the clip had been shared online more than I expected. Old customers left comments. Former employees sent messages. You taught me how to work with care. Your kitchen was my first safe place. It wasn't applause, it was recognition. And recognition, I realized, is different from validation. It doesn't ask you to prove yourself. It simply sees you. That week, I passed my son-in-law in the driveway when I dropped off a set of tools my daughter had asked for. He mentioned the segment. Didn't know you had that in your past, he said. I shrugged. It's not in the past. It's who I am. He looked like he wanted to add something, but didn't. Driving home, I thought about that wedding toast again. The narrowing of my life to a single job title, delivered with a smirk. That label hadn't been entirely wrong, but it had been incomplete. Maybe that was a real injury. Not the words, but the deliberate smallness of them. Now, the edges had widened again. Not because I fought for space at his table, but because I'd built my own elsewhere. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the light fade. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The kind of steady that comes when you stop waiting for someone else to adjust the frame. For the first time in a long while, I believed my story could be told without apology. And it already had been. The next chapter of my life didn't need their approval. It only needed my participation. The wedding anniversary dinner came as a surprise. My daughter called one evening, her voice uncertain, as if testing the ground. We're having a small gathering next month, she said. Family and close friends. We'd like you to come. I paused, thinking of the last time I'd sat in a room with them all. The toast, the laughter that didn't include me. Will it be comfortable? I asked. She hesitated. It's different now. I said I'd think about it. But by the end of the call, I already knew I would go. Not out of obligation, and not for reconciliation. I wanted to stand in the same room as before and feel the shift, not in them, but in me. The day came in early spring. The restaurant they'd chosen was quiet, with warm lighting and round tables set with candles. I arrived early, taking a seat at the far end. I didn't need the center of the room anymore. When they walked in, my daughter came straight to me, kissed my cheek, and pulled out the chair beside mine. My son-in-law gave a polite nod. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't dismissive either. Over dinner, the conversation wandered through safe topics: the weather, work, travel. Then, almost inevitably, someone mentioned the TV segment. One of their friends leaned in. I saw that story about you. I had no idea you were behind Harbor House. That place was a landmark. I smiled. It had its time. Another guest added, my parents used to take me there after school plays. I still remember the pie. The table shifted just slightly. My son-in-law glanced down at his plate, his fork motionless. He didn't interrupt. He didn't joke. I didn't push the moment. The younger version of me might have, turning it into a speech, proving something. But I'd learned that the most powerful moments aren't declared. They're allowed to stand on their own. Later in the evening, my daughter asked if I'd say a few words. Not as a performance, more as a thank you. I stood, my hands resting lightly on the back of my chair. I've been thinking about what it means to be seen. I said, sometimes it happens in unexpected ways. Sometimes not at all. But I've learned that it matters less who's watching and more what you're doing when they do. I didn't look at my son-in-law. though I felt his attention. This family has grown, shifted, and learned, and so have I. I'm glad to be here tonight. The applause was soft but genuine. I sat back down, feeling no surge of victory, just a quiet confirmation that the distance between us was no longer weighted with the same strain. When dessert arrived, my daughter leaned close. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. Driving home, I thought about how people often expect redemption to arrive with fireworks, with public apologies or grand gestures. But sometimes it's just a chair pulled out for you, a space made where there wasn't one before. The bitterness I'd once carried felt lighter, not gone but changed, and in that change, there was room for something else. I parked in front of my house and sat in the quiet for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled. I realized I'd stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped planning how I'd respond if certain things were said. I didn't need those defenses anymore. When I finally stepped out into the night air, I felt something settle, like a door closing without the slam. The evening hadn't rewritten the past, but it added a new page, one I didn't mind turning to again. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like just anything. It wasn't until weeks later that the last thread of it all pulled into place. I was having coffee at a small cafe downtown, the kind with scratched wooden tables and sunlight that fell in strips across the floor. I just paid my bill when I heard someone call my name. It was one of the wedding guests, someone I barely knew, a friend of my son-in-law's. He looked almost sheepish as he approached. "I've been meaning to tell you," he said. "That night at the wedding, I laughed along. I didn't know any better. But I saw your TV segment afterward, and..." He shook his head. It made me think about how quick we are to judge people. I nodded, not to dismiss his words, but to let them land without making him more uncomfortable. "You carry yourself differently now," he added. "It's hard to explain, but I just wanted to say I respect you." I thanked him, and he left, and I stood there for a moment, watching the door swing shut. That conversation could have gone unsaid, but the fact that it didn't, that he sought me out, was enough. I walked outside into the cool air, and instead of turning toward home, I went the long way, past the street where Harbor House used to stand, past the corner where I used to wait for deliveries, past the block where I'd once worked shifts to keep the lights on. It was all gone now, replaced by boutiques and cafes, and things that would never carry my fingerprints. But I didn't feel lost anymore. I felt completion. That night my daughter called. We talked about nothing urgent. The garden, the weather, a book she was reading. At one point she said, "I think things are better now, don't you?" "I do," I told her. It wasn't an apology, but I didn't need one. What I needed was a shift, and I had it. A week later, I was back at the same cafe. The owner, who knew me well enough now, asked if I'd mind speaking to a young server who was thinking about a career in hospitality. I agreed. The conversation was short, but when I left, I realized I'd just done something I hadn't in years, passed something forward without worrying about who would recognize it. In the end, the wedding insult had been just a moment. The years after had been real work. The slow rebuilding of my sense of worth. The decision to live without chasing recognition. The quiet refusal to let someone else's words define me. I think about that sometimes, the way people imagine victories as loud, decisive things. But my victory was in the quiet choices. To show up, to stand steady, to keep building a life in which other people's definitions didn't matter. On my kitchen counter now sits a small framed photo from the anniversary dinner. In it, I'm seated at the far end of the table, smiling, not for the camera, but for the moment. My daughter's hand rests lightly on my arm. It's not a perfect picture. The light is uneven, and we're both slightly out of focus. but it's real, and that's enough. As I look at it now, I think about the man I was the night of that wedding reception, the man who stayed silent, who let the words "just a waiter" hang in the air like a verdict. I don't regret that silence anymore. It wasn't weakness. It was a first step in a longer conversation, one I've been having ever since, not with him, but with myself. And the truth is, I'm still answering it. Every day. In my own way. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your country below.